Imagine standing at the edge of a medieval moat, staring up at a castle's massive walls. The gatehouse looms above you, its iron-tipped portcullis ready to drop at a moment's notice. But the most fascinating part of this fortress isn't the towering stone or the archers lining the battlement, it's the drawbridge. At first glance, it might seem like just a practical way to cross the water, a simple plank of wood on hinges. But look closer and you'll realize it's so much more. Every detail, from the width of the planks to the mechanisms that raised and lowered it, was a carefully calculated message. This wasn't just engineering, it was psychology carved into oak and iron. What if I told you that a drawbridge was less about keeping people out and more about revealing what a kingdom feared most? These weren't just barriers, they were mirrors reflecting the anxieties of the rulers who built them. A narrow drawbridge forced attackers to bottleneck, exposing them to arrows and boiling oil, but it also hinted at a king's paranoia about betrayal. A drawbridge that could be raised in seconds spoke of a realm haunted by sudden raids. Even the materials used, oak reinforced with iron bands, whispered stories of scarce resources or the threat of fire. Every choice was a clue, a silent admission of vulnerability disguised as strength. So why does this matter today? Because these drawbridges weren't just medieval relics. They were the original security systems, designed to manipulate perception as much as they were to stop armies. They show us how fear shapes technology, how rulers used spectacle to control their subjects, and how even the mightiest fortresses had weaknesses they couldn't hide. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel the secrets hidden in these ancient designs. You'll discover how a drawbridge could betray a king's deepest insecurities, why some were built to fail on purpose, and what their symbols meant to the people who crossed them. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a journey into the minds of those who lived and died by these gates. So let's step across the threshold and see what these bridges can teach us about power, fear, and the stories we build to survive. The earliest drawbridges were deceptively simple, just thick wooden beams laid across a ditch or moat. But even these humble beginnings carried weight. Picture a local lord in the 9th century, his small wooden fort surrounded by nothing more than a shallow trench. When visitors approached, servants would haul that crude plank into place, a ritual that transformed an everyday path into a controlled gateway. That simple act sent a message: you enter by permission alone. Yet these basic bridges had a flaw: they couldn't be raised quickly. Anyone could rush across before defenders reacted, revealing a harsh truth. Early rulers weren't just afraid of outsiders, they feared their own people might turn against them in a moment of chaos. As castles grew taller and moats wider, the drawbridge had to evolve. By the 11th century, you'd see counterweight systems, massive logs chained to the bridge's underside, allowing a single guard to lift it with a winch. That innovation wasn't just about engineering, it was about control. Now a king could sever access instantly, whether from invading knights or a rebellious mob. But look at where these mechanisms were placed. Many castles positioned the winch inside the gatehouse, hidden from view. Why? Because the mystery amplified fear. Peasants might hear the groan of ropes and the thunder of wood slamming shut, but they couldn't see the hands pulling the levers. Power thrives in the unseen. Some rulers took this further, designing drawbridges that were almost theatrical. At Château-de-Caussy in France, the bridge spanned over 20 feet, wide enough for a grand procession, yet narrow enough to bottleneck attackers. Its iron reinforcements weren't just functional, they gleamed in the sunlight, a visible reminder of the castle's might. But here's the twist: that same bridge had a hidden weakness. The hinges were deliberately fragile, designed to collapse if enemies tried to ram it, a show of strength masking a calculated vulnerability. What's fascinating is how these designs mirrored regional fears. In England, where Viking raids were constant, drawbridges often had spikes on their undersides not to impale attackers, but to deter them from swimming beneath. In Spain, where sieges could last months, bridges were built with removable center sections, turning them into jigsaw puzzles only the defenders could solve. Each variation whispered the same truth. Every kingdom's greatest fear was written in its timber and iron, if you knew how to read it. By the late Middle Ages, the drawbridge had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Crossing one meant stepping into a ruler's mind, their pride in the intricate carvings adorning the wood, their dread in the speed it could vanish beneath you. And perhaps that's the real lesson. These bridges weren't just barriers, they were living contracts. They promised safety to those who obeyed and ruin to those who challenged. A king's power wasn't just in his walls, it was in the creak of a hinge, the shadow of a raised plank, and the unspoken question, who controls the threshold? A raised drawbridge didn't just block the path, it spoke a language everyone understood. To the merchant hoping to sell his wares, its lifted planks said, "Wait." To the enemy camped beyond the moat, it screamed, "You are not welcome here." But for those inside the castle walls, that same bridge was a performance of control, a carefully staged reassurance that danger could be shut out with a single command. The psychology behind these mechanisms reveals something profound about medieval power dynamics. Fear wasn't just managed, it was weaponized, and the drawbridge was its loudest voice. Take the speed of operation, for instance. In castles along the Scottish border, where surprise raids were constant, drawbridges could be raised in under a minute. That urgency wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. Imagine the scene, a guard spotting movement in the distance, the frantic turning of a winch, the deafening crash of wood meeting stone. For villagers gathered inside, that rapid response reinforced their dependence on the Lord's protection, but it also exposed his deepest fear, that threats could emerge from anywhere at any moment. Contrast that with the drawbridges of wealthy Italian city-states, where lifting mechanisms were deliberately slower, even cumbersome. Why? Because those rulers weren't afraid of sudden attacks, they feared looking weak. A leisurely raised bridge projected confidence, as if to say, "We have all the time in the world to decide your fate." Then there were the bridges designed to fail. At Crac des Chevaliers, the Crusader fortress in Syria, engineers built a drawbridge with a deliberately fragile pivot point. From the outside, it looked impregnable, thick oak reinforced with iron. But attackers who tried to force their way across would suddenly find themselves plummeting into a hidden pit. This wasn't just clever engineering, it was psychological warfare. The very act of crossing became a test of trust. Would the bridge hold, or had the defenders already decided your fate? For those inside, it created a chilling illusion of invincibility, as if the castle itself could judge who deserved passage. Even the materials told a story. In regions where timber was scarce, like the arid plains of Castile, drawbridges were built from whatever wood could be found, often patched together with metal scraps. These patchwork designs whispered of scarcity and improvisation, hinting at rulers stretched thin by constant war. Meanwhile, in the wealthy Low Countries, bridges were crafted from imported Baltic oak, their surfaces polished smooth and carved with intricate patterns. Those decorations weren't vanity, they were propaganda. A peasant stepping onto such a bridge would feel the weight of their lord's wealth beneath their feet, a tactile reminder of who held the resources and the power. Perhaps the most telling detail was the gap left when a drawbridge was raised. That empty space between moat and wall wasn't just a defensive feature, it was a metaphor. It forced everyone, ally or enemy, to confront the same truth. Access was conditional, loyalty was temporary, and safety was an illusion that could vanish with the turn of a winch. In the end, these bridges were never just about keeping people out. They were about controlling the narrative of fear itself, proving that in the Middle Ages, the strongest fortresses weren't made of stone, they were built in the mind. The true genius of a medieval drawbridge wasn't just in its ability to block an entrance, it was in the symphony of fear it orchestrated. Every component, from the groaning winch to the iron teeth lining its underside, was meticulously designed to unsettle. Consider the chains, thick, rusted links that screeched like a wounded animal when the bridge lifted. That sound wasn't an accident, it was psychological warfare. To an approaching army, the noise signaled more than a closed gate. It was a visceral reminder that the castle's defenders held all the leverage. Even the delay mattered. Some bridges took agonizing minutes to rise, stretching the tension like a bowstring. Attackers would stand helpless, watching their window of opportunity slam shut inch by inch, their frustration mounting with every creak of the mechanism. Then there were the traps masquerading as bridges. At Malbork Castle in Poland, the drawbridge concealed a brutal surprise. Its surface was studded with removable iron spikes. From a distance, it appeared ordinary, luring enemies into a false sense of security. But the moment they charged, defenders would yank the spikes upright, transforming the bridge into a forest of blades. Other castles took deception further, like the infamous false floor bridges of Bohemia. These had planks that looked solid but were actually thin veneers over pits filled with sharpened stakes. Step in the wrong spot and the bridge would crumble beneath you. These weren't just defensive measures, they were performances of cruelty, staged to make invaders question every footfall. Even the materials were chosen for their psychological impact. Iron reinforcements weren't merely structural, they were visual threats, polished to gleam menacingly in the sunlight. The message was clear: cross this, and you'll meet metal far sharper than these decorative bands. Some bridges went further, embedding fragments of broken weapons into their wood sword hilts, arrowheads, even the occasional helmet. These grisly mosaics served as trophies and warnings, a gallery of past failures for new enemies to ponder. But perhaps the most chilling detail was the intentional fragility. Many drawbridges had a kill switch, a single rope or pin that, when cut, would send the entire structure crashing down. This wasn't just a last resort, it was a calculated display of control. Defenders could sacrifice the bridge in an instant, abandoning allies outside to prove no life was worth risking the castle's safety. That duality, protection for some, doom for others, was the drawbridge's darkest lesson. It taught everyone, friend or foe, that survival depended on the whims of those holding the winch. In the end, these bridges weren't just barriers, they were theaters of dread, where every bolt and hinge played a role in the spectacle of fear. In the shadow of advancing siege tactics, the medieval world saw a revolution in drawbridge design, one driven by raw, unrelenting fear. The counterweight drawbridge didn't just appear overnight, it was born from desperation. Picture a border lord in 12th century Normandy, his scouts racing back with news of an approaching army. The old drawbridge, hauled up by hand, would take minutes to secure, minutes his enemies could exploit. But with the new counterweight system, a single guard could drop the bridge shut in seconds, buying precious time to rally defenders. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a confession. Every castle that adopted this design was silently admitting, "We live in constant dread of the unexpected." The mechanics were simple but devastatingly effective. A massive wooden or stone counterbalance, often hidden within the gatehouse, offset the bridge's weight. Pull a lever and gravity did the rest. The bridge would snap upward like a jaws. But the real innovation wasn't in the physics, it was in the message it sent. In regions like the Welsh Marches, where rebellion simmered like a pot about to boil, these bridges became ubiquitous. Their speed was a warning: trust no one, not even the peasants who tilled your fields. A slow drawbridge might as well have been an invitation. A fast one was a declaration of paranoia. Look at where these systems flourished. Along the volatile borders of the Holy Roman Empire, castles sprouted counterweight bridges like nervous ticks. In Scotland, where clan rivalries turned violent without warning, the swiftness of a bridge's rise often meant the difference between survival and slaughter. Even the design of the counterweights betrayed local fears. Some were encased in iron to prevent sabotage, proof that lords feared betrayal from within as much as invasion from without. Others were disguised as decorative features, their deadly purpose hidden beneath carved grotesques or coats of arms. Fear, after all, wears many masks. The psychological impact was just as calculated. For villagers seeking refuge during an attack, the sight of their lord's bridge rising without hesitation was both comfort and curse. It promised safety, yes, but only if they reached it in time. That tension between protection and exclusion was the counterweight bridge's true mastery. It didn't just defend a castle, it trained everyone nearby to live in a state of readiness, to internalize the ruler's anxiety as their own. In the end, these bridges weren't just feats of engineering. They were clocks ticking down to the next crisis, each second measured in the creak of ropes and the groan of wood. And for the people who lived under their shadow, time was always running out. Nothing exposed a ruler's fear of betrayal more than the Portcullis Drawbridge hybrid, a masterpiece of medieval suspicion. Picture this: a heavy iron portcullis suspended just inches above a raised drawbridge, its spikes glinting like teeth. Together, they formed a 1-2 punch of defense, but their real purpose was darker. This wasn't just about stopping invaders, it was about surviving the moment your own knights turned against you. In castles like Dover or Caernarfon, where rebellion simmered beneath the surface, these dual systems weren't just practical, they were psychological shackles. The mechanics were brutally efficient. A drawbridge could be raised to block entry, while the portcullis could drop vertically, sealing the gatehouse like a guillotine. But the true genius lay in their interplay. If attackers somehow breached the drawbridge, the portcullis would already be slamming down behind them, trapping them in a deadly kill zone. More chillingly, this design forced defenders to choose who lived or died. A lord could lower the drawbridge to welcome allies, yet keep the portcullis half raised, a silent warning that trust had limits. Look at where these hybrids thrived: the fractured kingdoms of Burgundy, the scheming courts of Renaissance Italy, the volatile borderlands where loyalties shifted with the seasons. In these places, the Portcullis Drawbridge combo wasn't just architecture, it was a survival manual. The Teutonic Knights in Prussia took it further, adding murder holes above the gate so that even if traitors made it past both barriers, they'd still be pelted with rocks and boiling pitch. Every layer screamed the same truth: no one gets in unchallenged, not even you. The symbolism cut deeper than the iron spikes. A portcullis was often emblazoned with the Lord's coat of arms, a reminder that betrayal wasn't just a crime, it was an insult to the very identity of the realm. And the drawbridge, its hinges were frequently positioned inside the castle, where only trusted guards could reach them. That spatial control mirrored the social order, power concentrated at the center, radiating outward through chains of command and suspicion. Perhaps the most telling detail was the winch system. In some castles, like Pyrifon's in France, the mechanisms for raising the drawbridge and lowering the portcullis were operated from separate rooms. No single person could control both. This wasn't just redundancy, It was institutionalized distrust baked into the castle's bones. Even the act of crossing became a test. Merchants or diplomats would step onto the drawbridge, hear the portcullis creak ominously behind them, and realize too late that they weren't guests, they were prisoners in transit. These hybrid gates didn't just defend against betrayal, they weaponized the fear of it. Every groan of the winch, every clank of the portcullis chains reinforced the same lesson. In this world, loyalty was provisional, and safety was a privilege revoked at the slightest doubt. The message echoed far beyond the castle walls, shaping societies where trust was as rare and as heavily guarded as gold. Among the most cunning defenses in medieval castles were the false drawbridges, elaborate deceptions crafted for rulers who trusted no one, not even the stone beneath their feet. These weren't just traps, they were psychological labyrinths. Imagine a spy slipping into a castle under cover of darkness, heart pounding as they cross what appears to be the main drawbridge, only to find themselves funneled into a courtyard with no exit, archers already grinning from the walls above. This was the essence of the false bridge, a stage set for betrayal designed to turn the enemy's cunning against them. Take the infamous example of Château de Tarascon in Provence. From a distance, its false drawbridge looked identical to the real one, same iron reinforcements, same weathered oak planks. But the hinges were rigged to collapse under the weight of a charging force, sending soldiers tumbling into a pit lined with wooden stakes. The real bridge, meanwhile, was hidden behind a curtain wall, accessible only to those who knew the secret path. This wasn't just engineering, it was theater. The castle's lord, René of Anjou, was a man haunted by plots. His own brothers had tried to usurp him twice. His false bridge wasn't just a defense, it was a revenge fantasy carved into wood. The psychology behind these decoys reveals a darker truth. Rulers feared spies more than armies. In the fractured kingdoms of 15th century Spain, where cousins schemed for thrones and servants could be bribed with a bag of silver, castles like Almodovar del Rio added blind bridges that led to sealed chambers. Unsuspecting infiltrators would find themselves trapped in windowless rooms, the door locking behind them. No weapons, no battle cries, just silence and the creeping realization that they'd been outwitted. What's chilling is how these designs evolved alongside medieval espionage tactics. In Bohemia, King Wenceslaus IV built a drawbridge that split down the middle when triggered, dividing attackers into isolated groups. The mechanism was disguised as a decorative iron seam, a detail only a trained mason might notice. This wasn't just paranoia, it was a response to a very real threat. Wenceslaus had survived 3 assassination attempts, each orchestrated by his own nobles. His false bridge was a lesson in royal distrust. Even beauty could be a weapon. The ultimate expression of this deceit, castles with twin drawbridges, one real, one fake. At Malbork, the Teutonic Knights installed a decoy bridge on the western approach, its planks slightly narrower than the genuine article. Invaders who took the bait would find themselves funneled into a killing ground, while merchants and allies used the hidden eastern bridge, its entrance concealed behind a chapel. This duality spoke volumes about the knight's worldview, faith for show, brutality for business. These bridges did more than trap enemies, they reshaped behavior. A lord who commissioned a false drawbridge wasn't just protecting his walls, he was broadcasting his ruthlessness. Every whispered rumor of a collapsed bridge or a vanished spy reinforced his reputation for outthinking challengers. In an age where information traveled as slowly as a horse could gallop, these structures were propaganda in motion. They turned fear into a spectacle and deceit into a virtue. To cross a medieval drawbridge was to step into a game where the rules were written in invisible ink, and only the house always won. In the dead of winter, when frost turned moats to glass and siege camps grew desperate, a castle's drawbridge became more than a barrier, it became a rationing device. Picture a lord peering from his gatehouse at a line of hungry villagers, their carts laden with the last scraps of grain from harvested fields. Lowering the bridge meant salvation for some, starvation for others. This was scarcity weaponized. Across Europe, drawbridges evolved with features tailored not just for war, but for controlling the lifeblood of a kingdom, its food. Narrow passages forced supply carts to slow to a crawl, while collapsible sections allowed defenders to sever access with a single axe blow to a rope. Every design choice whispered the same truth: loyalty would be rewarded with bread, defiance with empty bellies. The architecture of hunger was brutally precise. At Carcassonne, the drawbridge's walkway was barely wider than a donkey's hips, ensuring only trickle of supplies could enter. In Bohemia's Karlstegen castle, engineers added a pivoting middle section that could tilt downward, dumping excess cargo into the moat if guards deemed it too generous. These weren't just defensive tweaks, they were economic choke points. A ruler who controlled the bridge controlled who ate and when. During the siege of Rouen in the early 15th century, chroniclers recorded how the English garrison raised their drawbridge just high enough to admit sacks of flour, but not the desperate mothers clutching children at their skirts. The message was clear: food was power, and the bridge was its gatekeeper. Some castles took this further, turning their drawbridges into calibrated instruments of suffering. The Teutonic Knights installed grain-measuring grooves along the planks at Malbork castle marks, indicating how much barley or rye could cross before the bridge was withdrawn. In drought-stricken Castile, drawbridges often had iron grills beneath their surfaces, allowing guards to inspect every sack for contraband while standing safely above. Even the act of crossing became transactional. At Château de Cessigno in Brittany, merchants had to pay a toll in kind, not with coins, but with portions of their cargo before the winchmen would lower the bridge fully. The psychological toll was calculated. A slowly lowering drawbridge forced starving outsiders to witness feasts they'd never taste. At Harlech Castle during the Welsh rebellions, defenders would deliberately bake bread near the gatehouse, letting the scent taunt besiegers camped beyond the moat. Other castles staged mock distributions, lowering bridges just enough to tease with barrels of salt fish, then yanking them skyward as hands reached out. These cruelties weren't just about survival, they were about domination. A population that associated the sound of creaking hinges with hope and its absence with despair would learn obedience faster than any army could teach it. Perhaps the most telling designs were the starvation bridges of late medieval Italy. In city-states like Siena, drawbridges were built with hollow chambers where guards could hide extra rations, invisible to the crowds below. The bridge itself became a pantry, its mechanisms greased with the same oil used to preserve sausages. When rivals like Florence tightened blockades, these hidden reserves let rulers feed loyalists while their enemies wasted away. It was scarcity engineered into spectacle, proof that in the Middle Ages the greatest fortress wasn't made of stone, but of full stomachs and broken promises. Some drawbridges carried more than just the weight of soldiers and supplies, they bore the burden of souls. In medieval theocracies, where earthly power and divine will were inseparable, these bridges became altars of judgment. Crosses carved into the wood, scripture etched along the hinges, even the winches themselves shaped like praying hands. Every detail transformed a military mechanism into a sacred test. To raise such a bridge wasn't merely a tactical decision, it was an act of moral arbitration, as if God himself were lowering the final gate. Take the Teutonic Knights' stronghold at Marienburg. Their drawbridge featured a towering relief of Saint Michael weighing souls, his scales mirrored in the bridge's balancing mechanism. When the Order's enemies, often pagan Lithuanians, approached, defenders didn't just see invaders, they saw heretics stumbling toward divine retribution. The bridge's descent became a performance of celestial justice, with the knights as heaven's executioners. Even the counterweights told a story, iron balls engraved with biblical verses about the fate of the wicked. Every creak of the winch echoed with psalms. In Spain's Reconquista kingdoms, the symbolism grew darker. At Avila's walls, the drawbridge bore an inscription from Ezekiel, "I will bring a sword upon you." Moorish prisoners forced to repair it would kneel on planks etched with crosses, their labor twisted into involuntary penance. The message was viciously clear. Submission to Christian rule wasn't just political, it was salvation. Some bridges took this further, like the Confessional Bridge of Toledo, where the underside was studded with iron nails arranged like rosary beads. To cross it meant literally walking under the shadow of forced conversion. The psychological impact was devastatingly effective. Peasants watching their lord raise a holy drawbridge didn't just see a gate closing, they witnessed a covenant being honored. During the Albigensian Crusade, Carcassonne's defenders painted their bridges' underside with scenes of hellfire, visible only as attackers retreated. Those images haunted survivors for years, their terror magnified by the certainty that God had chosen sides. Even the mechanics played a role. In Burgundy, winches were sometimes turned by monks rather than soldiers, so the act of sealing the castle became a liturgical rite. What's chilling is how these designs inverted morality. A ruler who starved besiegers could claim he was purging sinners. A bridge that collapsed under enemies became divine intervention. This was fear sanctified, where every strategic cruelty could be justified as holy wrath. The ultimate lesson: in the Middle Ages, even piety had hinges, and they creaked with the sound of selective mercy. Nothing exposed a medieval ruler's dread of irrelevance like the moment new siege weapons appeared on the horizon. The drawbridge, once the crown jewel of castle defense, suddenly faced its own mortality, not from battering rams but from progress itself. When trebuchets could hurl stones heavy enough to splinter oak, and early cannons could blast through iron reinforcements, these gates weren't just vulnerable, they were becoming relics. The frantic adaptations that followed revealed a panic deeper than fear of invasion. The terror of being left behind by history. Consider the irony. Many of the same lords who'd spent fortunes carving their coats of arms into drawbridge timbers now watched as engineers scrambled to retrofit them with crude iron plating. At Château de Vincennes outside Paris, workers bolted thick metal sheets to the bridge's underside not for elegance, but sheer survival. The result was a Frankenstein's monster of medieval and emerging technology, a drawbridge weighed down by its own armor, groaning under the burden of progress. Even its counterweights had to be doubled, turning what was once a swift defensive maneuver into a laborious ordeal. Every upgrade came with a cost, and not just in coin. The more fortified the bridge became, the less functional it was, until some castles found themselves with gates so heavy they could barely lift them. Yet other rulers made the opposite gamble, abandoning drawbridges altogether. Along the Scottish border, where cannon fire from English besiegers grew frequent, castles like Tantallon replaced their wooden bridges with static stone arches. These weren't just practical choices, they were admissions of defeat. A fixed bridge screamed, "We've given up on the old ways," but it also whispered something darker, that the age of chivalric defense, of raised gates and honorable sieges, was crumbling as fast as the walls it once protected. The psychological toll of this arms race was palpable. In Krakow, Polish engineers tried splitting the difference, building a drawbridge that could fold upward into a makeshift iron wall. It was ingenious until the first cannonball struck, warping the mechanism beyond repair. For every innovator who raced to adapt, there were traditionalists who clung to the past. At Raglan Castle in Wales, the aging lord insisted on keeping his ornate wooden drawbridge long after it was obsolete, polishing its carvings while his advisors begged for reinforcements. His stubbornness wasn't just nostalgia, it was denial. To replace the bridge would mean admitting his entire worldview. The code of castle warfare he'd built his life around was obsolete. What's revealing is where these changes took root first. In regions like northern Italy, where mercenary armies traded the latest siege techniques like currency, drawbridges vanished almost overnight. But in isolated strongholds like the Pyrenees, they persisted for decades. Their defenders praying tradition would triumph over technology. The divide wasn't just tactical, it was cultural. Some kingdoms saw innovation as survival, others as surrender. Perhaps the most poignant relics are the hybrid bridges, those caught between eras. At Caerphilly in Wales, archaeologists found a drawbridge modified with cannonball-proof iron grills, yet still sporting its original medieval winch system. It's a snapshot of a world in transition, where fear of the future and reverence for the past clashed in every hinge and bolt. These bridges didn't just fail because they couldn't stop cannon fire. They failed because they were trying to serve two masters at once. And in that struggle, they became something far more human than military hardware. They became monuments to the universal terror of time itself, and the crushing weight of knowing no fortress, no matter how mighty, can hold back progress forever. The most terrifying drawbridges weren't the ones that held firm. They were the ones designed to betray. Imagine charging across what seems like solid oak, only to feel the planks shudder beneath your feet, then give way entirely. That moment of freefall, the sickening crack of wood, the screams of comrades vanishing into darkness, this wasn't just defense. It was theater, orchestrated to turn courage into terror. Castles like Beaumaris in Wales took this to chilling extremes. Their drawbridges hid pivoting sections that would tilt downward when weighted, dumping attackers into waterlogged pits filled with sharpened stakes. The engineers didn't just build these features, they fine-tuned them. The angle of the drop was calculated to maximize confusion, not steep enough to trigger instinctive jumps, but just enough to ensure a stumbling, chaotic collapse. What's chilling is how these traps targeted the mind as much as the body. At Château de Pierrefonds, the drawbridge's collapse mechanism was rigged to a bell inside the castle. When the bridge fell, the clang would echo through the halls, a macabre dinner gong signaling another failed assault. Defenders would cheer while invaders froze, the sound branding itself into their memories. Next time they approached a castle, that bell would ring in their minds before it ever struck metal. Some rulers weaponized the landscape itself. The drawbridge at Loches in France spanned a moat teeming with starving pike. Survivors of the collapsing bridge wouldn't drown, they'd be torn apart. Meanwhile, Burgundian castles added sloped pits beneath their traps, so those who fell would slide helplessly toward iron grates where archers waited. These weren't just deaths, they were staged horrors designed to spread through campfire tales and erode morale long before the next siege. The psychological calculus was brutal. A single collapsing bridge could do more damage than a volley of arrows. At the siege of Kenilworth, chroniclers recorded how Saxon mercenaries refused to cross after witnessing a dozen men vanish into a pit. The drawbridge hadn't just killed, it had rewritten their risk assessment in real time. Even kings fell victim to this fear. Henry V allegedly delayed his assault on Meaux for weeks after scouts reported bridges that swallow men whole. Perhaps the most insidious designs were the ones that left survivors. Castles along the Rhine built drawbridges with partial collapse mechanisms, enough to maim but not kill. Retreating soldiers would drag themselves back to camp with splintered legs or missing hands, living advertisements of a ruler's ruthlessness. Their wounds sent a clearer message than any wall. Cross here, and you'll wish you hadn't. In the end, these bridges weren't just traps. They were propaganda machines, turning each failed assault into a lesson written in broken bodies and shattered nerve. There's a haunting scene etched into the margins of a 14th century manuscript from the Kingdom of Aragon. A castle with its drawbridge raised so high it nearly touches the gatehouse roof, its chains rusted in place. This wasn't a temporary defense, it was a permanent statement. Some rulers didn't just use drawbridges to control access, they welded them shut, transforming a functional mechanism into a manifesto. When King Martin the Humane of Sicily ordered his drawbridge chained permanently upward in 1409, he wasn't just preparing for war, he was declaring his realm closed for business. No merchants, no diplomats, no compromise. The moat became a moat of silence. This was isolationism carved into oak and iron. In regions where cultural identity felt under siege, like the Baltic states resisting German Crusaders or Granada's last Muslim emirs holding out against Christian reconquest, a raised drawbridge screamed defiance louder than any herald's proclamation. The Teutonic Knights' fortress at Reval took this to extremes, leaving their bridge raised for 11 straight years while pagan raids ravaged the countryside outside. Chroniclers wrote of envoys shouting offers of truce across the moat, their voices echoing off unmoving timbers. The message was clear: we'd rather starve than surrender our way of life. Yet the cost was staggering. Castles that sealed themselves off didn't just lose trade, they severed the flow of ideas. When the lords of Bern bricked up their drawbridge mechanism during the Albigensian Crusade, they also cut themselves off from new agricultural techniques brewing in Toulouse. Isolated strongholds often rotted from within, their granaries full but their knowledge stagnant. That's the cruel irony of these bridges. They preserved power at the price of progress. The symbolism cut deeper than the moats. In Hungary's borderlands, where Ottoman influence crept closer each year, warlords painted their raised drawbridges blood red as a warning. Crossing wasn't just forbidden, it was sacrilege. Meanwhile, in Scotland's Western Isles, clan chieftains hung the carcasses of butchered livestock from their suspended bridges, a grisly announcement that no outside laws applied here. These weren't just tactical choices, they were performances of independence staged for enemies and subjects alike. Perhaps the most telling detail was the deliberate decay. Chronicles describe drawbridges left to warp in the rain, their hinges screeching in the wind like ghosts. By abandoning maintenance, rulers turned neglect into a virtue, a visual shorthand for rejecting foreign influence. When Burgundian engineers offered to repair the rotting bridge at Montségur, the Cathar lords reportedly laughed. Let it crumble. The weaker the bridge, the purer our faith. In the end, these sealed gates did more than keep people out. They turned castles into islands of ideology where principles mattered more than survival. That's why archaeologists find so many of these sites with their drawbridge mechanisms still locked centuries later, frozen in their final act of defiance. The wood may have rotted, but the statement remains. Some fears run so deep, they outlast even the stones meant to contain them. The most unsettling drawbridges weren't designed to stop enemies. They were built to imprison the very soldiers who manned them. Picture this, a garrison under siege, flames licking at the gatehouse, when suddenly a panicked guard turns to flee only to find the drawbridge he just raised won't lower again. The mechanism jams, the winch snaps, and the escape route becomes a death trap. This wasn't an accident. Castles like Château de Fougeres in Brittany installed traitor bridges with counterweights that could be secretly disengaged, leaving defenders no choice but to stand and fight. The message was ruthless. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced with architectural spite. These two-way traps reveal a chilling truth about medieval warfare. Some rulers feared their own men more than the enemy outside. Take the infamous Witch's Jaw Bridge at Bran Castle in Transylvania. Its iron-reinforced planks appeared normal until a hidden lever was pulled, causing the entire structure to tilt inward. Any soldier attempting to retreat would slide back into the killing zone, his betrayal rewarded with a broken neck. The design wasn't just practical, it was psychological theater. By turning the bridge itself into a Judas, the castle's lord ensured his troops internalized one unshakable rule: advance or die. The geography of these betrayals tells its own story. In border regions like the Scottish Marches, where mercenary armies changed sides with the wind, drawbridges often had dual trigger mechanisms. Outer guards could raise the bridge against invaders, while inner guards could override them, sealing everyone outside to their fate. At Dunstanburgh Castle, excavation revealed grooves in the gatehouse floor where additional locking bars could be slid into place, physically preventing the bridge from lowering once raised. These weren't just defenses, they were institutionalized distrust built stone by stone. What's even darker is how these bridges weaponized shame. At Mont Saint Michel, chroniclers describe a drawbridge with bells rigged to ring when someone tampered with the winch. A fleeing soldier wouldn't just meet physical barriers, he'd announce his cowardice to the entire garrison. Other castles took this further, like the Crimson Bridge of Carcassonne, whose hinges would emit a blood-red powder when forced, marking deserters with an indelible stain. The symbolism was vicious. Betrayal wasn't just punished, it was branded. Perhaps the most haunting examples come from the Crusader states, where European knights faced an enemy they couldn't understand and heat they couldn't endure. At Crac des Chevaliers, engineers built a drawbridge that could only be lowered from the keep's highest tower, a place accessible solely to the commander. When Saracen forces breached the outer walls in 1271, desperate knights reportedly pounded on the winch room door, begging for escape. The bridge never budged. Archaeology confirms why. The mechanism had been deliberately dismantled days earlier. The Grand Master would rather see every man die than risk one fleeing heretic tarnishing the Order's reputation. These bridges did more than trap bodies, they reshaped minds. A soldier who knew retreat was architecturally impossible fought differently. His back against literal and figurative walls, he became both defender and prisoner of the fortress he served. In the end, these designs exposed the cruel calculus of medieval power. When rulers couldn't trust hearts, they built guarantees into hinges and chains. The true enemy wasn't always outside the walls. Sometimes he was the one holding the keys. The true price of a drawbridge wasn't measured in timber or iron. It was counted in the sweat of peasants and the emptying of royal coffers. Behind every creaking hinge and polished plank lay an economic gamble, one that could cripple a kingdom as surely as any siege. Take the infamous example of Burgundy's Château de Germans, where Duke Philip the Bold spent nearly half his annual revenue on a single drawbridge mechanism so elaborate, it required imported Italian engineers to install. The bridge's gilded carvings and counterweights shaped like mythical beasts weren't just for show. They were a desperate flex of financial muscle, proof that even a realm drowning in debt could pretend at invincibility. Contrast that with the ramshackle bridges of the Scottish Highlands, where clan chiefs lashed together driftwood and salvaged ship timbers. These patchwork structures might have looked crude, but their very simplicity was a survival tactic. When Robert the Bruce's forces retreated to the Isles after Bannockburn, they built drawbridges that could be dismantled and carried by ox cart, a stark admission that land and loyalty were fleeting, but mobility meant survival. The difference between these two approaches wasn't just about resources, it was about priorities. One ruler saw the drawbridge as a crown jewel, the other as a disposable tool. The accounting records tell the real story. In the ledgers of Castile's Alcazar of Segovia, scribes meticulously noted every nail and rope used in the bridge's construction, right down to the cost of feeding the carpenters. These weren't just receipts, they were stress maps of a kingdom's economy. When Henry IV of England ordered his treasurers to audit the Tower of London's defences, they discovered the Drawbridges refurbishment had cost more than feeding the entire royal household for a year. The shock wasn't in the number itself, it was in what it revealed about misplaced priorities. A king could starve his people to gild his gates. Some rulers turned this extravagance into propaganda. The Doge of Venice commissioned a drawbridge for the Palazzo Ducale with glass panels embedded in its surface, a literal transparent floor forcing visitors to confront the watery depths below. The message, "Cross us and you'll see exactly where you'll end up." But the real power play was in the material itself. Venetian glass was exorbitantly expensive, a flex of trade dominance as much as military might. Meanwhile, in the drought-ravaged plains of Andalusia, Moorish emirs built bridges with hollow timbers that doubled as secret water reservoirs, their defenses pulling double duty as drought insurance. The most telling designs emerged during crises. When the Black Death emptied European treasuries, desperate lords resorted to ghost bridges, drawbridges left half-finished, their rusted chains dangling over dry moats like skeletal fingers. At Cahors in France, townspeople revolted upon discovering their taxes had funded an ornate bridge while plague victims rotted in the streets. The revolt wasn't just against the lord. It was against the very idea that security meant sacrificing humanity. Perhaps the cruelest irony was how these financial strains bred innovation. Bankrupt kingdoms pioneered modular drawbridges with interchangeable parts, while cash-strapped Welsh princes developed collapsible designs using tensioned willow branches instead of iron. Necessity didn't just mother invention, it forced rulers to confront hard truths. A drawbridge wasn't proof of strength, it was a ledger of compromises where every splintered plank whispered the cost of fear. In the end, these structures didn't just span moats, they connected two equally dangerous precipices, bankruptcy and vulnerability, with no safe path between. The 100 Years' War didn't just reshape borders, it reinvented the drawbridge. In the smoke-choked battlefields between France and England, these once static gates became laboratories of desperation and ingenuity. Take the French response to English longbowmen. Castles like Château-Gaillard rebuilt their drawbridges with steeply angled approach ramps, forcing archers to fire upward into the wind, their deadly arrows losing force before they could strike defenders. But the real innovation was speed. French engineers stripped away ornamentation, crafting bridges so lightweight a child could crank them up in seconds. This wasn't just efficiency, it was survival. With English chevauchée raids burning villages without warning, a slow bridge meant slaughter. Across the Channel, English priorities hardened into oak and iron. Their occupied castles in Normandy, places like Harfleur, boasted drawbridges with double-thick planks, layered like armor to repel the new terror of gunpowder artillery. Unlike the French obsession with swift retreat, English designs embraced stubborn endurance. Some even had sacrificial outer layers that could be burned away during sieges, revealing fresh timber beneath. The message was clear. France wanted to escape threats. England intended to outlast them. The contrasts went deeper than materials. French bridges often had intricate pulley systems allowing a single guard to operate them from multiple vantage points, a necessity when garrisons were stretched thin. English commanders, meanwhile, installed drawbridges that could only be raised from the keep's deepest chamber, ensuring no panicked soldier could abandon his post prematurely. These weren't just technical differences, they were cultural fingerprints. France's bridges reflected a kingdom constantly adapting, England's a realm digging in its heels. Nowhere was this divide clearer than at the Siege of Rouen. French defenders had replaced their bridges' counterweights with sacks of sand, easily adjusted to account for wounded men scrambling across. The English attackers, by contrast, brought prefabricated bridge sections to throw across the moat, their engineers prioritizing brute force solutions over finesse. When the city fell, chroniclers noted how the victors immediately installed an English-style bridge with iron-reinforced locking bars, as if to stamp their philosophy onto conquered stone. The war's legacy lingers in bizarre hybrid designs. In Bordeaux, archaeologists found a drawbridge with French-style winches but English iron plating, a physical manifestation of shifting loyalties. Even more telling are the traitor bridges of Burgundy, whose mechanisms could be reversed mid-siege to favor whichever side offered more gold. These structures became mercenaries in their own right, their hinges greased with betrayal. What's haunting is how these wartime innovations outlasted the conflict. Long after the fighting ended, French castles kept their lightning-fast bridges, a permanent tremor of urgency in their design. English strongholds retained their armored behemoths, their bulk whispering of stubborn pride. The 100 Years' War didn't just change who ruled what land, it etched two worldviews into timber and chain, proving that even in peace, fear never fully lowers its gates. Venice's drawbridges didn't just cross water, they danced with it. In a city where streets were rivers and horses were replaced by gondolas, these floating gates became extensions of Venetian identity. Take the Pont della Paglia near the Doge's Palace. Its drawbridge mechanism wasn't hidden away like in landlocked castles but displayed proudly, its brass winches polished to mirror the canals below. This was defense as performance art. Every time the bridge lifted to allow a ship passage, it staged a miniature drama of power, the Republic's dominance over both land and sea, bending the very cityscape to its will. The rituals around these bridges reveal their dual purpose. During the annual marriage of the sea ceremony, the Doge's golden barge would pause beneath a raised drawbridge while he dropped a jeweled ring into the waves. The timing was precise. The bridge had to begin lowering just as the ring touched water, symbolizing Venice's unbreakable bond with the Adriatic. What other kingdom would turn a military mechanism into a sacred prop? Even the materials whispered of maritime obsession. Unlike the iron-clad bridges of mountain fortresses, Venetian versions used bronze resistant to salt corrosion, yes, but also deliberately reminiscent of ship fittings. To cross one was to step onto a vessel, blurring the line between castle and galley. Some bridges served darker purposes. The Pont dei Sospiri's infamous Bridge of Sighs wasn't a drawbridge itself, but its design directly influenced Venice's defensive spans. Its stone bars and narrow passage forced prisoners to contort sideways, a feature replicated in the city's Watergate drawbridges to bottleneck invaders. The message was clear: Venice would treat enemies like criminals long before they reached a cell. More chilling were the whisper bridges like the one at Arsenal, where engineers added hollow chambers beneath the planks. As mercenaries marched across, hidden listeners could eavesdrop on their conversations, filtering loyalty through architecture. What's most striking is how these structures adapted to Venice's greatest fear, not invasion but irrelevance. As Ottoman fleets dominated the eastern Mediterranean, the Republic rebuilt its bridges with exaggerated heights, allowing ever larger ships to pass beneath. It was a desperate pantomime of maritime supremacy, like a fading actor donning louder costumes. By the 16th century, some drawbridges near Rialto were more theater than defense, their lifting mechanisms gilded and their timbers painted with scenes of naval victories that hadn't happened. The truth was in the tides. As Venice's power ebbed, its bridges became beautiful lies, their reflections shimmering on water that no longer obeyed them. Yet even in decline, they retained symbolic weight. When Napoleon finally dismantled the Republic in 1797, his first act was seizing control of the Arsenal Drawbridge, not for its strategic value, but because he understood its power as a psychological lever. To lower that bridge was to announce Venice's surrender not just of territory, but of 8 centuries of maritime mythology. Today's tourists snapping selfies on the Academia Bridge might not realize it, but they're standing on the bones of a machine that once measured history not in years, but in the rhythm of rising and falling tides. In the sun-scorched Levant, where Crusader castles clung to rocky outcrops like weary sentinels, drawbridges weren't just gates, they were tightropes strung between survival and diplomacy. Consider Crac des Chevaliers, the greatest fortress of the Knights Hospitaller. Its drawbridge didn't just lift vertically like European models, it pivoted sideways, a design borrowed from Syrian engineers. This wasn't cultural curiosity, it was cold pragmatism. The sideways swing allowed defenders to partially open the bridge, admitting single-file traders or emissaries while keeping cavalry at bay. Every degree of rotation was a calibrated act of trust in a land where alliances shifted like desert sands. The materials told their own story of uneasy fusion. Unlike the oak-heavy bridges of France, Crusader drawbridges often used cedar from Lebanon's mountains, lighter, more resistant to rot, and familiar to local craftsmen. But look closer, and you'd spot Frankish ironwork reinforcing the joints, a stubborn insistence on European methods where it mattered most. These hybrid structures mirrored the Crusaders themselves, outwardly adapting yet clinging to home in crucial details. Even the counterweights betrayed this duality. At Margat Castle, massive limestone blocks quarried locally but carved with Latin crosses, hung from chains wrought by Damascene smiths. Fear and practicality welded together in plain sight. What's revealing is how these bridges managed perception. Muslim chroniclers describe Kerak Castle's drawbridge adorned with Arabic calligraphy praising peace, until attackers drew near, when hidden panels would flip to reveal crosses and Crusader slogans. This wasn't just deception, it was psychological judo, using the enemy's own aesthetic language to unsettle them. Other castles employed more brutal theatrics. At Beaufort, the drawbridge's underside was studded with hooks from which the defenders hung captured Mamluk armor, transforming the bridge into a grotesque trophy wall that swayed ominously over anyone approaching. The true test came during sieges, when these bridges became lifelines and liabilities in equal measure. During Saladin's campaign against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, his engineers noticed something peculiar. Crusader drawbridges often had weaker hinges on the outer edges. This wasn't poor craftsmanship, it was a calculated gamble. By allowing attackers to partially breach the bridge, defenders could lure them into kill zones before collapsing the structure entirely. At the Siege of Safed in 1266, this tactic backfired spectacularly when Mamluk sappers exploited the weakness faster than anticipated, turning the Crusaders' own trick against them. Perhaps the most poignant remnants are the truce bridges of coastal strongholds like Atlet. These had dual winch systems, one operated by Franks inside the castle, another by Muslim guards in an exterior gatehouse. During ceasefires, both sides had to cooperate to lower the bridge for prisoner exchanges or supply caravans. The grooves worn into their stone housings showed decades of uneasy collaboration, where enemies became temporary partners in the dance of survival. In the end, these Levantine drawbridges were more than military tools. They were mirrors held up to the Crusaders' fractured identity. Too foreign to fully belong, yet too entrenched to leave, they built gates that could pivot both ways, just like their loyalties. The wood may have rotted and the iron rusted, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the strongest defenses aren't walls that keep others out, but hinges that allow careful, controlled connection. A raised drawbridge in medieval art was never just wood and iron. It was a loaded symbol, heavy with meaning. Look closely at the Bayeux Tapestry, where William the Conqueror's forces advanced toward a castle with its bridge defiantly lifted. The embroidered scene isn't merely showing a tactical defense, it's broadcasting isolation, resistance, a kingdom closing ranks. Contrast that with the lavishly illustrated Tres Riches Hures du Duc de Berry, where a lowered drawbridge frames a scene of feasting and music. Here, the open gate isn't just an architectural detail, it's an embrace, an invitation to the warmth and wealth within. Literature amplified these contrasts. In Arthurian legends, the bridge to Camelot is often described as gilded and welcoming, its hinges oiled to silence, a metaphor for Arthur's ideal of just rule. But cross into darker tales like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and suddenly drawbridges groan under the weight of impending doom. When Gawain approaches the eerie castle of Hotdesert, the bridge rises and falls with uncanny timing, as if the structure itself is judging his worthiness. These weren't random details, they were narrative triggers, training audiences to feel tension or relief based on a bridge's position. Even religious texts weaponized the imagery. Dante's Inferno describes the gates of Dis slamming shut with a drawbridge's finality, trapping sinners beyond redemption. Meanwhile, illuminated psalters depicted paradise with pearly bridges that never raised, eternal guarantees of divine welcome. The message was clear. In the medieval mind, a bridge's movement or stasis could map the entire moral universe. Artists played with these expectations. A 15th century Flemish painting of the Nativity shows the Holy Family sheltered in a ruined castle, its drawbridge permanently lowered to signify God's open invitation. Yet in the same era, depictions of Judas' betrayal often included a raised bridge in the background, visually severing his path to redemption. The symbolism was so ingrained that viewers needed no explanation. The language of hinges and counterweights had become a cultural shorthand. What's fascinating is how these portrayals bled back into reality. Chronicles from the Wars of the Roses describe lords staging elaborate bridge-lowering ceremonies for visiting allies, consciously mimicking the art they'd grown up with. When King Charles VI of France entered Paris after a victory, the city's drawbridges were draped in blue velvet and sprinkled with gold leaf, not for function, but to become living illustrations of power and piety. The ultimate proof of this symbolism's grip lies in its inversion. When reformers wanted to attack corrupt monasteries, they produced woodcuts showing abbots pocketing coins while the poor starved outside raised bridges, a direct visual link to biblical parables. The drawbridge had transcended stone and timber. It had become a moral barometer, its position indicting or absolving those who controlled it. In the end, these artistic choices reveal something profound. To medieval people, a bridge wasn't just something you crossed. It was a statement you believed. The thunder of cannons didn't just topple castle walls, it shattered the very logic of the drawbridge. By the 16th century, gunpowder had rewritten the rules of warfare, and those towering oak gates suddenly looked as outdated as a leather shield against a musket ball. The math was brutal. Where a trebuchet might take days to breach a gate, a single well-placed cannon shot could splinter a drawbridge's mechanism in seconds. At the Siege of Rhodes in 1522, Ottoman artillery reduced the Knights Hospitaller's prized drawbridge to smoldering kindling before noon, proving that no amount of iron reinforcement could withstand the new age of warfare. Yet the drawbridge's obsolescence birthed an unexpected afterlife. As castles morphed from fortresses into palaces, architects kept the familiar form but stripped away its function. The moat at Chambord in France became a decorative ribbon of water, its drawbridge frozen in the lowered position, a ceremonial relic for processions rather than defense. These symbolic bridges whispered a quiet truth. Power had shifted from brute strength to pageantry. A ruler no longer needed to bar his gates. He could fling them open wide, confident that his authority now rested on bureaucracy and diplomacy rather than hinges and counterweights. Folklore embraced this transformation with peculiar tenderness. German woodcuts from the 17th century show fairy tale castles with drawbridges perpetually mid-descent, as if frozen in the act of welcome. The brothers Grimm's Rapunzel lets down her hair like a living bridge, echoing the medieval gate's surrender to myth. Even the language lingered. Shakespeare's plays are peppered with drawbridge metaphors, from Macbeth's dagger of the mind, hovering like a raised gate, to Hamlet's lament that Denmark had become a prison whose bridge is burned behind me. The most poignant survivals were the deliberate preservations. At Warwick Castle in England, the earls kept their drawbridge operational long after it served any military purpose, not for defense but for theater. Visitors in the 1700s would gasp as the bridge creaked upward on command, a staged relic of danger in an age of growing safety. Similarly, the Doge's Palace in Venice maintained its ceremonial bridge, lifting ritual well into the 19th century, turning what was once a life or death mechanism into a tourist attraction. What's revealing is where these bridges clung to actual utility. In remote corners of Europe, Scottish clan towers, Transylvanian outposts, drawbridges persisted into the 1800s, not because they worked but because they remembered. A Highland chieftain raising his petty bridge against tax collectors was performing an act of defiance as much as defense, using antiquated technology to make a very modern point about autonomy. The drawbridge's true legacy lies in the paradox it became, a thing too obsolete to use, yet too potent to discard. Modern suspension bridges echo their medieval ancestors not in timber and iron, but in their cultural weight. When London's Tower Bridge lifts its bascules for ships, it's reenacting a 700-year-old drama of access and exclusion. The drawbridge taught us that barriers are never just physical. They're psychological stages where we perform our deepest fears and aspirations. Even in ruins, their hinges still creak with meaning. The echoes of medieval drawbridges reverberate in places you'd least expect, like the retractable bridges of modern cities. London's Tower Bridge isn't just a feat of Victorian engineering. It's a direct descendant of those creaking castle gates. Every time its bascules lift to allow ships passage, it reenacts the same dance of access and exclusion that once defined fortress life. Even the mechanics are eerily familiar. Hydraulic pistons have replaced counterweights, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Control the bridge, and you control who or what moves through your domain. Nowhere is this medieval mindset more alive than in cybersecurity. Firewalls and encryption protocols are today's portcullises and moats, guarding digital castles where data is the new gold. Think about two-factor authentication. It's essentially a drawbridge with two winches. You might know the password, but without that second verification, the gate stays shut. Just like a medieval lord who required both a token and a spoken oath before lowering the bridge, modern systems demand multiple proofs of trust. The stakes have changed, but the paranoia hasn't. Airports offer another stark parallel. Those security checkpoints with their zigzagging queues, they're spiritual successors to the bottleneck drawbridges of old, forcing travelers into controlled pathways where every bag and body can be scrutinized. The TSA agent checking your ID plays the same role as the gatekeeper peering down from the murder holes, deciding in seconds whether you're ally or threat. Even the psychology is identical. The visible spectacle of screening reassures some while intimidating others. just as a gleaming, spike-studded bridge once did. Urban design tells a similar story. Gated communities with their hydraulic barriers and biometric scanners are the fortified manners of the 21st century. The drawbridge might now be a sleek metal arm rising from asphalt, but the message is the same. Safety comes at the cost of exclusion. Researchers have even noted how these neighborhoods, like their medieval counterparts, often isolate themselves from broader societal problems, creating modern moats of privilege. Perhaps the most haunting continuity lies in border walls. From Hungary's razor wire fences to the bollard-studded barriers along the Rio Grande, these structures use the same principles as Crusader castles. Motion sensors replace sentry towers, drones stand in for archers, but the goal is identical: to make crossing a calculated risk. Some even feature modern versions of collapsing bridges' retractable roadblocks that can vanish into the ground at the press of a button, stranding those deemed undesirable. The lesson is clear: though the materials have evolved, human nature hasn't. We still build thresholds that test loyalty, still weaponize access, still disguise fragility behind displays of strength. The drawbridge was never just a tool, it was a mirror. And if we look closely at today's barriers, digital or physical, we'll see the same ancient fears staring back: who gets in, who stays out, and who holds the winch. Hollywood would have us believe every medieval drawbridge was a death trap waiting to snap shut, an Indiana Jones fantasy of spikes, trapdoors, and bottomless pits. But the truth is far more fascinating than fiction. Take the classic collapsing bridge trope. While some castles did feature trick mechanisms, most traps were simply fail-safes against sieges. At Conwy Castle in Wales, archaeologists found grooves suggesting the drawbridge could be intentionally dropped if enemies breached it not as a sneaky trap, but as a last resort barrier. The real genius wasn't in sudden drops, but in designs that made attackers waste precious time. Consider the myth of the spiked underside. Films love showing bridges lined with iron spikes that impaled charging soldiers. In reality, spikes were rare and served a different purpose. At Caerphilly Castle, the few surviving examples are blunt and widely spaced, meant to deter enemies from climbing the raised bridge, not to skewer them. The exaggeration likely came from medieval chroniclers embellishing battles to glorify their patrons. A scribe describing bridges dripping with the blood of foes made better propaganda than admitting most sieges ended with negotiations, not dramatic last stands. Even the infamous false floor traps weren't what pop culture suggests. Chateau de Pyrifon's had planks that could be removed to create gaps, but these weren't hidden traps. They were clearly marked and used to drop debris on sappers tunneling below. The real psychological warfare was subtler. At Crac des Chevaliers, the drawbridge's hinges were left unoiled so their ear-splitting screech would unsettle attackers. Noise was a weapon, and every creak amplified the castle's aura of menace. The most misunderstood feature, the so-called kill switch. Many castles did have a single rope or pin that could collapse the bridge, but it wasn't for dramatic ambushes. Records from Rouen reveal these were emergency measures used to sacrifice the bridge and seal the gatehouse during retreats. Far from being sneaky, this was a desperate last act, often leaving defenders stranded outside. The lesson here: real medieval warfare valued survival over spectacle. What's most revealing is how these myths persist. Modern security systems borrow the same exaggerated imagery, think laser grids in heist films, because primal fears sell better than practicality. Just as Hollywood's drawbridges are more about drama than history, our own myths about security reveal an uncomfortable truth. We'd rather believe in booby traps than admit how often real protection comes down to patience, maintenance, and the unglamorous work of turning a winch. A drawbridge descending wasn't just mechanics, it was theater. When a medieval king prepared to receive an ally, the lowering of the bridge became a meticulously timed performance. Servants polished the hinges until they gleamed, guards stood at rigid attention, trumpeters positioned themselves to hit the first note the moment the bridge touched earth. This wasn't just practicality, it was political choreography. The speed of the bridge's descent, the smoothness of its motion, even the sound of its chains all conveyed unspoken messages. A slow, silent lowering whispered reverence. A swift drop with clattering iron broadcasted confidence bordering on arrogance. Take the visit of Emperor Charles IV to Paris in 1378. Chronicles describe how the French king ordered his drawbridge oiled with perfumed fat so its descent would release a floral scent, a sensory detail meant to flatter the imperial guest. Meanwhile, at Milan's Castello Sforzesco, engineers rigged the drawbridge winches to play musical tones as they turned, transforming a defensive mechanism into a literal instrument of diplomacy. These flourishes reveal a truth often lost in tales of sieges and battles. Castles weren't just strongholds, they were stages where power performed its most delicate dances. The rituals surrounding these moments were just as calculated. In Burgundy, dukes developed an entire etiquette around bridge crossings. Ambassadors were required to pause midway across, allowing the drawbridge to creak ominously beneath them before proceeding, a subtle reminder of their host's power to revoke access at any moment. Venetian diplomats wrote home in frustration about the Doge's bridge at the Palazzo Ducale, which lifted fractionally higher for republics than for monarchies, a petty but deliberate slight encoded in timber and rope. Even the footsteps mattered. Scottish clan chiefs laid woven rugs over their drawbridges for important guests, not for comfort, but to muffle the sound of approach, creating the illusion that visitors floated effortlessly into their presence. Some ceremonies weaponized exclusion. During the 100 Years' War, the English garrison at Calais infamously staged mock lowerings, beginning the bridge's descent for French envoys, only to reverse it at the last second. The psychological warfare was brutal. The brief glimpse of the castle interior, suddenly snatched away, made the isolation outside feel crueler. Conversely, Spanish kings in Granada developed a ritual where the drawbridge would lower just enough to admit a single file of Moorish emissaries, forcing them to shuffle sideways like supplicants, a physical manifestation of Christian dominance over the once mighty caliphate. The most revealing ceremonies were those that never happened. When Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II demanded entry to a rebellious Genoa in 1245, the city left its drawbridge raised but draped in silk banners bearing his insignia. The message was exquisite in its duality. We acknowledge your authority, but not your presence. Similarly, Hungarian nobles resisting Habsburg rule would decorate their static bridges with garlands, a defiant celebration of their chosen isolation. These non-events spoke louder than any lowered bridge, proving that sometimes the most powerful performance was the one you refused to stage. In the end, these rituals outlasted the bridges themselves. Long after gunpowder made drawbridges obsolete, European courts preserved their symbolism. Napoleon crowned himself emperor beneath a replica drawbridge at Notre Dame. Victorian diplomats still spoke of lowering the drawbridge to describe trade negotiations. The wood may have rotted and the iron rusted, but the language of controlled access, of thresholds as political statements, remains etched into our collective memory. A raised bridge was never just a barrier. It was a question. How much of yourself are you willing to surrender for the privilege of crossing? The names may be lost to history, but the genius of medieval drawbridge engineers lives on in the very grain of the wood and the temper of the iron they shaped. These weren't solitary inventors toiling in obscurity. They were master collaborators, orchestrating a delicate ballet between carpentry, metallurgy, and military strategy. Picture the scene: a grizzled carpenter from Normandy consulting with a Venetian rope maker, while a retired siege engineer sketches calculations in the dirt. Their workshop wasn't some pristine laboratory, but a bustling castle yard ringing with hammers and saws, where every splinter and spark contributed to the birth of a defensive masterpiece. What's remarkable is how these anonymous innovators solved problems we still grapple with today. Take load distribution, the challenge of supporting immense weight without sacrificing mobility. At Château de Vincennes, archaeologists discovered drawbridge planks with subtly tapered ends, reducing stress on the hinges by nearly 30%. This wasn't guesswork, it was applied physics, honed through generations of trial and error. The blacksmiths who forged the hinges were just as ingenious, layering wrought and cast iron to create components that were flexible yet unbreakable. A single hinge might bear the weight of 24 armored knights, yet swing smoothly at a child's touch when properly balanced. The real magic lay in the collaboration between disciplines. A master carpenter knew exactly how to season oak so it wouldn't warp under a moat's humidity, while the blacksmith timed his ironwork to match the wood's expansion in summer heat. At Beaumaris Castle in Wales, the entire drawbridge system was designed around seasonal changes. The counterweights adjusted monthly to account for wood swelling, while the iron reinforcements were deliberately undersized in winter, allowing room for summer expansion. This wasn't just engineering, it was a dialogue between materials, climate, and human ingenuity. Some innovations bordered on artistry. The winch systems at Crac des Chevaliers featured helical gears cut from lignum vitae, a tropical hardwood so dense it could mesh with metal counterparts without splintering. These weren't crude cranks, but precision instruments that allowed a single operator to lift 3 tons with the effort of turning a doorknob. Even the ropes told a story of innovation. Spanish engineers developed a technique of weaving hemp with horsehair, creating cables that resisted rot while maintaining just enough stretch to absorb sudden shocks. What's most humbling is how these engineers worked within brutal constraints. Unlike modern projects with unlimited budgets, they often repurposed materials from captured siege engines or dismantled ships. A dendrochronology study at Dover Castle revealed that its famous drawbridge contained timbers salvaged from 3 different wrecked galleys, each piece meticulously scarfed together. The iron bands came from melted-down arrowheads, their composition revealing they'd been collected after multiple battles. Every component carried hidden histories of adaptation and survival. The true testament to their skill: how many bridges outlasted the castles they served. While crumbling walls might betray a fortress's age, the drawbridge mechanisms often remained operational centuries later. At the Tower of London, the same winch system installed in the 1300s was still lowering the bridge for ceremonial occasions when Queen Victoria took the throne. That longevity wasn't accidental, it was baked into every joint and pivot, proof that the greatest innovations aren't always the loudest, but the ones that endure in silent, steadfast service. Medieval folklore brims with drawbridges that pulse with supernatural life, not as mere crossings, but as sentient judges of the soul. Consider the Breton legend of the Château de Trésesson, where a ghostly bride paces the drawbridge each midnight, her spectral hands testing the ropes for weakness. Local lore claims she was walled alive by her brothers for loving beneath her station, and now her restless spirit scrutinizes every visitor, as if searching for someone worthy to hear her plea. This wasn't just a ghost story, it was a cautionary tale about the consequences of violating social barriers, where the bridge itself became a purgatory between classes. Other legends weaponized the drawbridge's duality. In the German epic Dietrich of Bern, a cursed bridge at the castle of Virginal demands 3 sacrifices before allowing passage, but the twist reveals these aren't lives but lies. Knights must confess their darkest secrets to the timbers, and only those speaking truth feel the planks solidify beneath their feet. The allegory is piercing. In an era where oaths bound society, the drawbridge became a literal truth-teller, its creaks and groans echoing the weight of unspoken sins. Welsh bards took this further with tales of singing bridges like the one at Caerphilly, where harp strings were woven into the ropes. Only those with pure intentions could cross without triggering a dissonant wail, a folkloric ancestor to modern lie detectors. Some stories blurred the line between bridge and beast. The Gesta Romanorum, a medieval story collection, describes a Hungarian fortress guarded by a drawbridge with iron teeth that snapped like a wolf's jaws at midnight. Historians trace this trope to real fears of Ottoman incursions, transforming invasion anxiety into a monster one could hear gnashing in the dark. Even King Arthur's myths got in on the act. Later versions of the Lancelot Grail cycle describe Camelot's bridge thinning to a knife's edge when traitors approached, forcing them to balance their sins literally. Fail, and you plunged into a moat filled not with water, but with the accusing faces of those you'd wronged. The most chilling tales emerged from plague years. Italian novelle tell of bridges that burned the unworthy, their flames invisible until the victim was midway across. Florentine merchants whispered of a ledger keeper who burst into blue fire after shortchanging orphans, his ashes spelling out the stolen sums on the scorched planks. Here, the drawbridge became divine accountant, its moral arithmetic harsher than any courtroom. What unites these stories is their obsession with liminality. A drawbridge in folklore was never just wood and iron. It was the ultimate threshold between sacred and profane, living and dead, loyalty and betrayal. To cross one wasn't merely physical, it was a trial by architecture, where the very act of stepping forward laid bare your soul's ledger. The creak of the hinges might as well have been the voice of fate itself, whispering, "Prove you belong." The drawbridge's legacy isn't locked in the past, it's etched into the DNA of modern security, whispering uncomfortable truths about human nature. Those medieval engineers grappling with oak and iron were wrestling with the same dilemma we face today: how to build barriers that work on minds as much as bodies. Consider the parallels between a castle's raised bridge and today's two-factor authentication. Both force a pause, a moment of verification where identity must be proven. The drawbridge's winch operator scrutinizing your insignia through murder holes isn't so different from your phone's facial recognition scanning biometric data before granting access. The tools have changed, but the dance of trust and suspicion remains eerily familiar. Look closer at social media's algorithmic moats. Platforms don't just keep threats out, they curate reality like a medieval lord controlling who crosses the threshold. The personalized feeds shaping our world, you function like those drawbridges adorned with symbols, welcoming some, intimidating others, all while broadcasting the gatekeeper's power. Even the collapse mechanisms have digital counterparts. When a platform suddenly deletes an account or shadowbans a user, it's the modern equivalent of that pivoting bridge at Chateau de Cousy, severing access without warning, leaving the stranded to wonder what invisible rule they've tripped. The real lesson lies in understanding what these barriers reveal about societal fears. Just as narrow drawbridges betrayed medieval rulers' dread of mob violence, today's security obsessions expose contemporary anxieties. Bulletproof backpacks in schools, gated communities with biometric scanners, even the explosive growth of VPNs, each is a modern drawbridge. Its design screaming louder than any press release about what keeps us awake at night. The Teutonic knights hanging armor from their bridge undersides to unsettle foes would instantly recognize the psychology behind today's cybersecurity wall of shame displays where companies flaunt the IP addresses of blocked hackers like digital trophies. Perhaps most telling is how both eras weaponize spectacle. A medieval peasant watching a drawbridge rise in seconds internalized their lord's power. Today, watching a hacker's face flash across a jumbotron at a cybersecurity conference serves the same purpose. The theatrics of defense, whether clanking chains or flashing firewall alerts, aren't just functional. They're rituals reinforcing who holds the keys. When Venetian engineers polished their bronze winches to mirror the canals, they understood something Silicon Valley architects now exploit. The shinier the barrier, the more it dazzles as both warning and advertisement. Yet for all their parallels, one critical difference emerges. Medieval drawbridges created visible divides. You could stand at the moat's edge and physically gauge your exclusion. Today's digital barriers are often invisible, their algorithms and encryption protocols hiding exclusion behind layers of abstraction. A rejected visa applicant sees no portcullis slammed shut. A shadowbanned activist hears no creak of withdrawing access. This invisibility makes modern gatekeeping more insidious and more easily denied. The drawbridge's brutal honesty, its raised position and unequivocal no, feels almost quaint in an age of soft denials and virtual barriers. The ultimate takeaway isn't about replicating medieval tactics, but recognizing their enduring logic. Whether guarding a castle or a cloud server, effective security has always blended physical deterrence with psychological impact. Those ancient engineers grasping for ways to make hinges screech and timbers groan understood something we're still relearning. The strongest barriers aren't just made of materials, but of the stories they let people tell themselves about safety, power, and who belongs on which side of the divide. Centuries may separate us from moats and murder holes, but the fundamental equation remains: every defense mechanism is ultimately a mirror, reflecting what a society values enough to protect and fears enough to wall away. The drawbridge was more than wood and iron. It was a mirror held up to the medieval world, reflecting its fears, ambitions, and contradictions. Every creak of its hinges, every gleam of its reinforcements, told a story about the people who built it. For kings, it was a declaration of control. For peasants, a reminder of their place. For enemies, a challenge. For allies, a fleeting promise of safety. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is this: the barriers we build say far more about us than the threats we fear. Consider how differently rulers wielded this simple mechanism. A paranoid lord might install a drawbridge that collapsed at the pull of a hidden lever, while a confident monarch would leave his bridge permanently lowered, daring challengers to approach. Some adorned their bridges with carvings of saints, turning them into sacred thresholds, while others hung the rusted armor of defeated foes beneath them, transforming crossings into gauntlets of shame. The choices weren't just tactical, they were autobiographies in oak and iron, confessing insecurities no chronicler would ever put to parchment. Even in ruins, these bridges speak. Walk the broken battlements of Chateau Gaillard or peer into the dry moat of Kenilworth, and you'll notice something startling. The drawbridge mechanisms are often the last parts to crumble. Their hinges outlive the walls they once protected, their counterweights weathering centuries longer than the crowns of the kings who commissioned them. There's poetry in that. The medieval world obsessed over stone walls and towering keeps, but it was these humble wooden gates, flexible, adaptable, riddled with vulnerabilities, that truly encapsulated the era's spirit. Today, we've replaced drawbridges with firewalls, moats with encryption protocols, and portcullises with biometric scans, yet the human impulses remain unchanged. We still build thresholds that test loyalty, still weaponize access, still disguise fragility behind displays of strength. The next time you pause at a security checkpoint or fumble with two-factor authentication, remember, you're participating in a ritual as old as cracked death chevaliers. The language has changed, but the conversation is the same. Who gets in, who stays out, and who holds the power to decide. If these echoes of the medieval world fascinate you, you're not alone. History's greatest lessons often hide in plain sight, woven into the fabric of everyday life. For more journeys into the past that shape our present, don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter is already waiting, and trust me, you won't want to miss where we cross next.